Hey guys, it's Jordan here from SwitchWatch. How are you doing today? Today's review is of Final Fantasy XII. Yes, yet another Final Fantasy game on the Switch. Let's see how this one is. As per usual with these Final Fantasy reviews, I just want to give you a quick disclosure as to my history with this entry. Final Fantasy XII came out in Europe in 2007. I was 16 at the time. I have to admit, my love for gaming was on the wane back then, as it was around the time that I actually started to have people called friends, pretty much for the first time. I know, unbelievable. I also started playing in rock bands, had a first proper girlfriend, and so on. Let's just say, I didn't keep up with games. But Final Fantasy XII was an exception. At that time, I considered the series to be my favourite, and on the rare occasion that I would check for gaming things, the upcoming release of 12 was what I kept an eye on. And after 5 years or so between the last proper game 10, it was possibly the first time I'd ever been hyped about a release. It came, I played it, and after about 10 hours I put it down and never picked it back up again. Why? Well, like I said, I had other interests at the time, but that didn't stop me sinking hundreds of hours into Elder Scrolls Oblivion. Final Fantasy XII was different, and at that time, I was way too immature to accept different. Perfect then that this Nintendo Switch port has come for me to give it another chance, hopefully a fairer one this time. The story for Final Fantasy XII stars Vaan, a young benevolent street rat living in Rabanastre. The kingdom is reeling in itself after being ravaged by war a few years ago and under occupation from the militaristic empire. Vaan dreams of being a sky pirate because, let's face it, who doesn't? He soon finds himself wound up in the political turmoil as the Empire looks to cement its claim to the land. Vaan escorts a surviving royal princess Ashe, along with the swashbuckling Balthier, his hot sidekick Fran, his childhood friend Penelo, and a disgraced knight thought to be a traitor, Bosch. It has that trademark political intrigue that the original director was known for in Final Fantasy Tactics. The plotting, the high speak, the unraveling truths, it has all the markings of a classic. It just has one big problem for me: the characters. They're just kind of bland. Pretty much all of them lack any sort of personality outside of the dashing cocksure Balthier, who ascends above the mediocrity. You do grow to like them over time, but they are nowhere near the legendary status of previous Final Fantasy characters. Saying that you will enjoy the story, I'm sure. It's full of twists and turns and plods along at a nice, decent pace, but I feel it's one of the weaker entries in the series, especially around this time when, for me, 7, 8, 9, 10 all had phenomenal stories. This is just pretty decent. Final Fantasy XII marked the biggest shake-up in the series, at least in my opinion. While retaining many things that made it a Final Fantasy game, it also took drastic steps in order to make the series more modern from a gameplay perspective. It took inspiration from MMO games as well as other more progressive JRPGs of the time. Firstly, there are no random encounters. All fights with enemies are those that roam the world, similar to Xenoblade Chronicles games. There's no battle transition either, it's seamless. They also play out in real time and are also fairly automatic in their nature. If you choose to attack, your character will continue to do so until you change for another action. Other party members are fairly independent too and will often do their own thing, although they can be influenced with the Gambit system. In this remaster, you can actually issue orders to individual characters this time around, rather than relying on the AI too much. Obviously, with battles going at a quicker pace than normal in real time, it can be tough keeping up with the full party, but the computer does a decent job by itself. I'm sure you'll be used to it from JRPGs like Tales of Vesperia, also doing a similar thing. If you want to be more hands-off during battles, then you'll definitely want to rely on the gambits. This is where you basically program your individual fighters to do certain actions at specific instances that crop up during fights. It can be crazily specific at times, but a basic example shown early on is that you can assign characters to prioritize healing above everything else should an ally's health drop below a certain amount. It takes a bit of getting used to and a whole lot more experimentation, and I still don't think I quite understand it. It could be worth looking online for some tips if you're struggling to squeeze the potential out of it like I did. There are quite a few job classes to choose from. You're greeted with a selection of 12 different jobs. Some will be more familiar than others. You have your standard white mage, black mage, but then you have something like a foe breaker. Initially, each of the 6 party members can commit to just one job class, but can add another one later on, so you do have a full spread of them. Back when 12 originally released, one of my biggest issues with the game was the license board, which is what you use to develop your characters. I found this to be just a weak version of the sphere grid from 10. Maybe I just didn't quite grasp its potential, but it definitely felt uninspired and a step back. With the international version that released in Japan, it seems the game's designers felt that way too, and so implemented the previously talked about job system, which in doing so gave different license boards to each job, so everyone would develop differently rather than the same as would often happen before. It gives you less freedom, but in return gives you a far better focus and guidance. The old system led me to feel unsure as to what direction I was taking my characters in and reluctant to commit. It may sound like a contradiction, but these changes compared to the original really open the game up far more, despite you being assigned to only 2 restrictive classes rather than having an open board like the original. It's more focused and it breathes new life into what I originally thought to be just a very weak aspect. Those are really the major gimmicks of the game. It's a vast entry though, and there's far too much to actually talk about in a review. It's a packed game that was very different to what came before, and this remaster is even different than what you originally played. Sure, the story is the same, but the gameplay is pretty much overhauled, and I think that's for the better. So I know you guys want to know about the quality of life stuff that's often put into these ports or remasters, so firstly, in this release there is a speed up button which enables you to blast through sections of the game, or perhaps aid the grind, which is always a downer in RPGs, in my opinion. You can go for a safe ×2 speed, or just go full mayhem at ×4. That's what I did, and it makes battles a blast compared to normal. Although you do have to be careful because things can take a turn for the worse pretty quickly. I found the lack of this in Final Fantasy X disappointing, so I'm glad it's resurfaced here. And don't worry, the music still runs at the same speed as do cutscenes. Another sweet little addition is an auto-save feature. Considering enemies come in all shapes and sizes right from the beginning, it's entirely possible to get accidentally wiped out by one of them if you're just a little careless. Thankfully, the autosave feature that was also present in Final Fantasy IX can save your bacon again right here if you so choose. Sadly, there are no other modifiers that many were pleased to see in 7 and 9. No turning off random battles, well, because there aren't any anyways, no boosting your health mid-battle. It's a shame, I rarely use them, but they were useful once in a while to ease certain creases that the genre often fails to iron out. Another bummer is the lack of balancing. After playing through this remaster, I remember exactly which point I gave up on last time. It was on the Leviathan airship, where the end boss is pretty tough if you're not prepared. Unfortunately, it's a pain in the backside to actually be prepared, since the save point is well back before the boss, and you have to walk through endlessly respawning soldiers just to get to there. Just popping a save point right before the boss would have solved much of the frustration. And I know I'm not alone in feeling this. The level of requirement here was just a bit too steep. I think they could have considered stuff like this for this remaster. Final Fantasy XII marks the first soundtrack in the series not mostly composed by the legendary Nobuo Uematsu since he left the company a few years before. Instead, we're treated to a soundtrack mostly from Hitoshi Sakimoto. Big shoes to fill, right? No pressure, buddy. But considering this guy is best known for Final Fantasy Tactics, you need not worry too much. It's certainly very different to what had come before in a mainline game. It has a more fantastical feel, going for something more epic, more movie-like than what Nobuo used to go for. You can see the influence Tactics has had on this one, with the same themes from that game running through this one too, constantly. I like it for sure, but it does lack a distinctive personality despite its high quality. For example, I couldn't recall individual tracks or associate them with moments in the game. Don't get me wrong, it's highly listenable and probably more technically adept than what Nobuo had done before, but that doesn't always make it the best or most iconic. The entire soundtrack was re-recorded using a live orchestra, which, although I'm not privy to the expense of such a thing, I can imagine it was not cheap for the production costs. In comparison, it sounds fantastic, there's no question of that. You can always switch between the original two if you prefer to have the nostalgia of the synthesized original tunes. Also, a nice addition is the ability to switch between English and Japanese voice acting, something that was sadly missing in the Final Fantasy X compilation. Saying that the voice acting in English is actually quite good. It's really subdued and not over the top like most JRPGs would go for. There's loads of interesting accents which I found fascinating, like different regions have different ways of talking, just like in real life. I mean, there's an entire city with people talking in South African. How can you not love that? Visually, the game is very strong, especially on the Switch. Of course, you wouldn't expect it to trouble it too much, but as JRPGs go, is this the best looking one on the system? I actually don't know the answer to that. Let me know. Character models are strong, facial emotions are good, but I've always felt that visually, Final Fantasy XII was a step back from 10. Now, because of this remaster, I think it does look more impressive technically, but the art style hasn't won me over. I do like it, don't get me wrong, I know I've said that a lot, but the colour palette is on the bland side. Lots of browns, dark colours, and just an overall washed out look compared to the eye-popping tropical nature of 10. In handheld mode it looks great and is easily the best way to play. The cutscenes look especially fantastic. Performance wise, don't worry, it runs at a solid 30 frames per second, which is all you really need in a JRPG of this kind. On the eShop, Final Fantasy XII is priced at £44.99 in the UK and $49.99 and euros in the US and Europe. That's the same as 10 and 10 Part 2 HD Collection, which many of you were up in arms over at that price. So how about the fact that this is just one game? Well, I think there's a bigger overhaul here in terms of gameplay, which is very welcome, at least from my perspective, but if you didn't like the price for 10 and 10 Part 2, then you won't like this either. Personally, I think it's a little bit on the expensive side. You're getting one game here, sure, with plenty of content, but at the same time, I don't think it's quite the same quality as 10. Personally, I would have been much happier had the price been £10 or dollars cheaper. £35 would have been a much sweeter spot for me. Some may disagree, of course. I will say there's no way you're being ripped off by the chosen price here. You'll still get plenty of time out of this one, from the story mode, 2 new game plus modes, and a trial mode, which ascend the game to crazy levels of content and difficulty. Final Fantasy XII on the Switch is receiving a physical release, and thankfully everything is on the cartridge, unlike 10 and 10 Part 2, which only had half of the content on for the American and European release. As a physical collector myself, I would always advise going for that choice. If you're in the UK and you're thinking about picking this up, I'll pop a link in the description below to our Amazon shop, which we've curated many of the games that we reviewed, including this one. We'll also pop some Play Asia links if you need to import a copy to your location. We receive a small cut at no extra cost to you guys, and it helps us out so much. So please consider that. Before we get into my final thoughts, consider hitting that subscribe button if you're new here, and if you enjoyed this video so far. You'll get plenty more like this with reviews, gameplays, and features. It's well worth it. If you're not new, then continue to show your awesome support with a thumbs up and a comment. It helps us out far more than you think. What do you guys think of Final Fantasy XII? Overall, I'm so happy that I had the opportunity to give Final Fantasy XII another shot. I originally thought it was rather bland and lacking that blockbuster feel a mainline Final Fantasy game should have, and while I will say it's not near my top favourites, it's much higher than it once was. It has interesting combat, far better development system than it had before, but the characters are still uninteresting to me. Not bad by any means, but they lack the weight and iconicity that we're used to with a series as revered as this one. It's still a fantastic game though, one well worth a playthrough if you've never done so before, or perhaps you weren't so enamored with it back in the day like me. It's not quite the pinnacle of the series, but I can see many people wanting to debate that. For me, it's an 8.5 out of 10. Head over right now to enjoy a smorgasbord of other Final Fantasy reviews, 7, 9, 10, Chocobo, take your pick. I'll see you guys on the next one. I've got another import review lined up ready for you, so stay tuned for that.